much for having me. It's a pleasure, and nice vote of trust to know who I am and still invite me to a conference like this. So I didn't bring any slides. At the end of the day, I figured we might as well keep it casual, and also that way, the organizers have plausible deniability if I say anything blasphemous. I will leave some time for questions at the end, so please, if you have anything you want to say, feel free. If you have any bones you want to pick, feel free. So I am a lawyer. My background is in money, in public money, in the history of money, in macroeconomics, in central banking, monetary policy. I come from a family, my father was one of the first people to use a computer in the legal profession in Australia and helped design communications policy in Australia and Southeast Asia in the 80s. So I guess I was always interested in this stuff, and then came to law school and worked with one of the legal counsel who was working with the Free Software Foundation, and that was my first introduction to sort of serious tech politics and the big questions and the sort of long history of what we're all trying to do here. So trying to work out what I knew about money and the long history of banking and regulation of finance, and combining that with these sort of tech movements. I spent a lot of my time working with groups that do not have a product, do not have a venture capitalist backing them, and are not coming into these spaces with a solution in search of a problem, but rather usually communities that have specific needs on the ground, or who have other issues they already care about and then somehow find themselves intersecting with this kind of technology. So nowadays, when we talk about things like, for example, privacy, on one hand, it could be, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, what do I have to hide? And then you go speak to people who are regularly being harassed by the police, or having their data handed over to ICE in the United States, or who are having political resistance movements crushed because their ability to earn donations aren't possible. And suddenly that concept of privacy takes on a very different valency from my own life, or from the issues that I might care about on a daily basis, and starts becoming something that has significance to political movements that I profess to be interested in, or political values or social values. So when we start from that point of view, the question isn't, what are the problems we need to solve? There's a lot of people out there already telling us what the problems they need to solve. The question is, what do they not know that we know because we understand something about either money and finance or technology? And then I think that second question is just, why should people trust us, right? Why should people trust what you're having to say? So in the United States, where I spend most of my time nowadays, I actually got into this on the mobile money international development side, but in the United States, I find myself in a lot of rooms in Congress where there are politicians, and mostly by politicians I mean 20-year-old staffers who are really running the whole show behind the scenes of the politicians, trying to understand this stuff because they have a basic undergraduate economics textbook education and they read some New York Times article about crypto, and they're desperately afraid they're going to get it wrong. But also they're having everybody come in telling them that they've got a product that's going to be amazing, and all they need to do is, create an industry-friendly regulation. And they're the kind of people that are instinctively skeptical of that because they hear that narrative from literally every industry every single day. So the question isn't, why don't you trust us? It's, why should you trust us? You're an interested actor. You're a biased actor. Why should I have you walk in the door and speak to me like your company's interests are my polity's interests? And it's not to say there aren't products that do important things. I'm not here to tell you, well, you should stop doing the work you're doing. But I think it is important to step out of the kind of culture that gets created within an industry and look at how it gets looked at on the outside, and to take some time to validate that perspective. It's not that they don't necessarily understand what you're trying to do, it's that you're coming in with a particular profile, with a particular set of real concerns that have to be addressed at a level of trust and legitimacy before people are necessarily going to want to work with you. Not everybody, right? But certain kinds of people, certain people who aren't already considered themselves, friends of industry, who walk in and say the first thing is, how can I help money make money? So I got into this stuff around public money issues back in about 2011. You can sort of see Twitter comments where I was sort of denigrating Bitcoin, and Bitcoiners love to point that out now, saying, well, I hope you had fun staying poor, kind of thing. But my interest at that point, as it always was about the long-term secular development of these technologies and how they relate to public issues. So I looked at that point and said, okay, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on around the tech, there's a lot of private innovation, but when the dust finally settles, it's going to come back to the public money system, and it's going to come back to the kinds of questions that we've been dealing with for 25 years. It's going to have a different valency, but it's going to be those questions that ultimately then become the tail that wags the rest of the dog of this industry. So I started trying to think about what we could do about those things, and I watched central bankers and other public policymakers not pay attention to this stuff until when? You probably all were there, you probably paid some attention. Facebook's Libra, right? That's the moment when suddenly central bankers realized that they're going to miss a boat unless they did something about this stuff. And the conversation went from, this is interesting, but a long way away, to, oh, this is kind of cool, we're experimenting, but nothing certain, to, oh my God, this needs to happen tomorrow. But, as is often the case in these kinds of things, the people in the room who were making that decision in government were not elected officials, were not privacy advocates, were not consumer protection advocates, they were central bankers. And when you're coming from the industry side and when you're used to dealing with banks and central banking, you think central bankers are coextensive with the government, because most elected officials find this stuff very difficult and would prefer not to think about it if they can hand over responsibility to central bankers. But the reality is central bankers usually come from a particular economics discipline. They're trained in a certain pseudo-history about a lot of the money issues they talk about, and they mostly have training in statistical modeling. They're not people who care about civil liberties. They're not people who care about sound consumer practices on a daily basis. You talk to most central bankers about cash, and it's either an afterthought or it's an annoying thing getting in the way of them conducting monetary policy more effectively. And you speak to them about privacy, and they say, yeah, that's something that's very important, as long as it doesn't cost me any political capital at all. If the NSA calls me and asks me to put a backdoor in it, you think I'm going to stand up in Congress and fight them? Absolutely not. I didn't get into this business to become a freedom fighter. I got into this business to do statistical modeling. So you start to realize that the government isn't just one monolithic entity, and the people who are defining this conversation around central bank digital currencies don't even know what they're talking about, but the one thing they know is it's going to be a central bank digital currency, which means they're the ones that are going to define the agenda. So I'm sitting there watching this suddenly happen. Suddenly everybody's paying attention, and the conversation around privacy goes from one paragraph in a white paper that every central banker publishes to suddenly a bigger and bigger issue. And they say, of course it's important. Of course, if we don't get the public to trust it, no one's going to use it. And then in the next voice, Jay Powell says, but of course, pure anonymity is not possible, right? It's not viable, right? And everyone just nods along. So that's the political valency of central bankers. And if you treat that as coextensive with the state, then you're going to think that there's nobody in the state that really cares about privacy and anonymity, or at least if they do, they only care as much as the Jay Powells of the world. But the reality is, as they're coming to slowly and unfortunately realize, if you don't build something that's trusted, it won't work. And if they do need to build this thing because they're desperately afraid that they're going to lose political power to transnational corporations that don't consider themselves beholden to a certain polity, they're going to have to actually make this CBDC thing functional. So it's a terrible bind for them. They don't want to give consumers the autonomy that they know they need for them to use the product, but they also need the product to succeed. So that's one big issue that I think is coming down the pipeline. And one way to think about this, and this is sort of a theme of the three issues that I'll bring up today, is the difference between the battle line or the foreground and the rear ground of the battle line. So the foreground of this is privacy. And I think the rear ground, the more important issue, the one that, as with most hegemony, has been invisible in these conversations, just assumed rather than debated, is the question of a two-tier system. Should the central banks be handing over primary responsibility for the issuance of a CBDC to a bunch of private industry actors operating on a for-profit basis on the theory that market competition will ensure discipline and prevent abuse? That's the system we've had for the banking system for a century. That's the system that most people in crypto say that they're rebelling against, with the crony kind of concentration of power that comes with it. And yet every central banker says in the next breath, yeah, that's probably how we're going to do this one too, because we can't provide public services directly because we've never tried. And when we think about who our customers are, we think of commercial banks, not individual people. In fact, making the paper money is so beneath us that we're in the United States, we're just going to get the Treasury to do it, and we'll give the shipping to the banks for it. So this is the water in which I think that the privacy conversation takes place, which is true cash privacy is private because it's a bearer instrument that is a direct peer-to-peer direct relationship between an individual and the government. But if you have to have an intermediary, then of course you're going to be able to hold the intermediary accountable. Of course there's going to be political pressure to go after an intermediary. Half of crypto knows this. This is why they talk about disintermediating payments, et cetera, et cetera. So if we really care about privacy, if we really want something that looks like cash, something where you really don't have to ask permission to pay, where civil liberties are a serious priority, not just some lip service that people pay while they're building backdoors for intelligence services, then you're going to need to have a different vision of the right balance between public and private sector behavior. That's a hard thing to say to a bunch of people who are in a room because they're being paid by a company to provide a product. I'm not saying that to, again, assuage anyone's motivations, but just to be honest about where the blind spots are in conversations. There are blind spots in other conversations that I go into and talk about these issues to them. The second area that comes up here, and this was the next area that I could see coming, and it's come again, is stablecoins. Because it's one thing to say we want to create our own private currencies. We've had private currencies for centuries, millennia even, and the last presentation is a great example of how community currencies can do all sorts of interesting things for resiliency and allow for experimentation and all kinds of ways in which some hegemonic social structure might not accommodate difference or marginality. But it is very different from creating your own currency to create an instrument, a liability, denominated in another person's unit of account, and to ensure, or to give the impression that you can ensure, that that's going to have a stable value. That question is not a new question. We can add a new word like stablecoin to it, but in fact it's a very old question of banking. It's a question of banking that we spent hundreds of years not answering very well, and finally came up with an answer called deposit insurance, only to immediately forget the lesson of deposit insurance when it comes to the next generation of shadow monies like money market mutual funds, or e-money like Wirecard. So what we see today is there's a big debate around stablecoins and whether or not they're sufficiently safe. And the foreground of that debate is asset backing. It's whether or not we can ensure that the right assets are in some place that aren't going to be drained so that every stablecoin that is issued has some backing in some real value or some other financial value. That's the foreground of that debate. The background, right, the rear part of that debate is the liability side. Is there a difference between algorithmic stablecoins and non-algorithmic stablecoins? Of course. Is there a difference between a stablecoin that's fully backed by short-term treasury bills and one that's backed by a pool of other cryptocurrency assets? Of course. Are those differences as important as the commonality, which is that they're both promising to be able to pay dollars on demand and can't? No. Or at least, depending on what question you're asking, it may be less important. So the big question for stablecoins, in my opinion, is not about asset safety. It's not about whether or not we trust these individuals not to be dodgy like Tether. It's the difference between whether or not we think that we've learnt a new lesson from banking history or we've somehow solved a problem that we didn't successfully solve over and over. It's whether or not we think that asset risk, credit risk is the only form of institutional risk a stablecoin provider can offer or not. And if it isn't, we have to ask ourselves a different set of questions than merely, does the product I have pass some line that I can plausibly tell people it should be used? We won't have the risk manifest until it causes a systemic collapse. Historically speaking, the largest financial crises are always, first and foremost, crises in money markets. Safe assets that we think are safe stop becoming safe. The last issue is general crypto. And again, there's a bunch of questions, and I'm not in the expertise space to talk about all the different ways we could use blockchain technology. There have been a bunch of people talking about very interesting ways that we can use these technologies at this conference. But I think one of the big questions, again, stepping outside of the people in the industry from how they see themselves, is how other people see it. What use case are we solving? What are we actually offering to people? Most people don't trust finance. Why should they? What are you offering as a trust alternative? Do you look different from other finance people? Yeah, you can put on a hoodie. Are you offering a different set of values? Yeah, well, actually, we're half Wall Street and half Silicon Valley. That's even better, right? Well, what are you offering? Well, we're not going to collapse like your bank did. Really? Because I'm hearing a lot of collapses in the news. Well, we care about you. Do you? How? We care about your privacy. Oh, so this is private, is it? Well, terms and conditions apply. Right, so what are you offering me again? Well, we're going to get very rich. That part we're sure about. We're going to be the guy in the fancy high building 2 generations from now, whether we succeed on this or not. That we're sure about. So trust us and something will happen. We'll muddle it through. This is, to me, how the people that I speak to are trying to understand crypto. And I try to tell them there's some stuff there, but I'm also trying to not be dishonest to them that there's a real there to what they're sensing too. And that's not, again, to besmirch anyone in a room like this, but to be honest about the cultural dynamics of what's going on. I was there in live time watching a lot of these industries, and again, not to put on Ripple, because I think it's an exception often to those rules, but I was watching a lot of the industry sit there and welcome people like Salvador President Bukele onto stage because he said good things about crypto. If you're going to be a single issue voter on fintech, be prepared to lose everybody else for whom things like fascism and dictatorship is a problem. Who you partner with matters, right? So the foreground, I think, of all of this is, does it serve useful cases? Does it serve useful things? Is it something we can trust? And the background of that issue, to me, is the question of what kind of public monetary system do we actually want and deserve? If we had a working public safe payment system you could make instantaneous remittances around the world for free 20 years ago, if we had done what the director of the US Mint had proposed in a panel on the future of money in Congress in 1997, and created a stored value cash card like coins were that were purely private at the time, we wouldn't be here, or at least maybe a lot of it wouldn't be here. But we didn't, and now we are. So the big issue in the future, I think, is going to be, what are the public money questions that we are finally starting to address some way or another now? And when they're addressed, what's going to be left? Because it's not a matter of these two things are competing alternatives. It's a matter of most people, most of the time, for most of history, and most of the public legal system is going to rely on public money first. So whatever happens there is going to create a different environment for the rest of the questions we're addressing here. So crypto, the future of crypto, is downstream of the public money debate. So those are my three areas. Those are my three kind of pitches for you. One is CBDCs. We think it's about privacy, but really it's about the sort of neoliberal public-private partnership model and whether that's going to endure. Stable coins, we think it's about the safety of assets, but really it's about the perimeter of public money and public guarantees for a banking system. And crypto, where we think it's about trust and use cases, but it's really about what we want for public goods and what's left for the civil and private sectors. So I'll stop there.
Privileges and ask you the first question, and then we can open it up here. So humans are self-interested, corrupt. We tend to concentrate power and then abuse that power.
Some of the time.
Yes. Have you given thought to how this might play out differently in a developing economy where there aren't so many entrenched interests, where there isn't a codification of, there isn't a history of monetary policy and failures of that. Do you have more optimism in a place where this is a little bit more greenfield, a little bit more blank slate?
So I used to joke that I like that Henry Thoreau line about there are 1,000 people hacking at the branches of evil for every one hacking at the root, which is why I found myself 5,000 miles away from where I grew up, 2 miles away from Wall Street. Now the joke doesn't land as well because I live in Portland. But at the time, it was a good line. And I think the reality is, and coming from a country like Australia, and the Queen just passed away, God rest her soul, but I remember 1975 and the dismissal of our Prime Minister when he started questioning the intelligence services military base in the centre of Australia, and suddenly what we thought of as a vibrant Western parliamentary democracy was rendered a joke overnight, and the Prime Minister was sacked illegitimately. And that was the British Empire, that wasn't even the Americans, right? That's before we get to the 200 military bases around the world and the global financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank that have been doing the US bidding since the 40s. So when I think of developing countries, this is where I started. I started international relations, international development. I started in mobile money. And I think of the Gates Foundation. I think of the Omidyar Foundation. I think of the Better Than Cash Alliance at the United Nations. These are not greenfield places. These are places dealing with the history of colonialism and imperialism, where fintechs offering data services are the new guy coming in with a Bible. So I don't think these are green shoot areas. I think these are places that are especially vulnerable to exploitation by the same big pots of money 5 minutes down the road in Wall Street that we were fighting in DC in 2008 and never put anyone in jail for. Yeah.
Is there anything encouraging about the fact that some of the trust factor between, so like if a person is trying to understand how their money is being used, historically they just didn't get it, but now at least the macro goal is to encode trust right into the math of the system. Is there anything encouraging to you about people who maybe don't care how it works, just that it works?
I don't think it works. If it did work, I'd believe that, but I don't think you could trust math, right? Human institutions exist around math. And we can make math mean whatever it wants. I mean, the joke 2 plus 2 can't equal 5, of course it can. Court said that a person living in, Worcestershire was in Middlesex for 200 years because it was a convenient legal fiction, and the system worked. So I don't think that the math is actually the important thing. The important thing is who the guy with the gun says owns stuff. And that's always going to be a human and cultural question first. And if the math doesn't work, people will just come in and ignore it. So I do think actually one of the great meta benefits of this whole movement is that we are having a democratic money moment. Sociologists, historian colleagues of mine talk about human history goes in waves where monetary issues come to the forefront of the national attention and then they go back down again. Right? In the United States context, there were people saying, you can't crucify mankind on a cross of gold. This stuff was in the news every day. There were times when people had to read spreadsheets of bank prices, different banknotes, and how much they should be trusted. It was in people's minds. The last 30 or 40 years of pretending that economics is somehow value neutral and apolitical allowed us all to turn the volume down on those questions. It helped a certain group of people very, very handsomely. So we are exiting that time and entering a world where history is alive again and monetary politics are alive again. And I think in that respect, it's good. But again, the reason that that's important is because there are winners and losers and there are actors that are doing good things and bad things. And a lot of the ones doing bad things are going to hide behind math. So I don't think it's the be-all and end-all for that question, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Christy. I'm a geopolitical risk analyst most of the time, and I spend most of my time not here. And I have spent most of the last 20 years living and working in places where borders are largely irrelevant, and concept of tribe and family and clan is your identity, and what you say is your identity today could change tomorrow. I know that you understand what I'm talking about from your words a few minutes ago. I want to push you a little bit, if I may. I'm partly satisfied by your answer on this concept of greenfield a moment ago, which I agree with you profoundly no longer exists. That's development thinking from 20 years ago, and it's out of date. Can I push you a little bit, please, to define here where you see this battleground and who is doing the fighting? Are you really talking about a US battleground and a US fight? Or are there global actors in this? And if so, whom and over what time frame, please?
Yeah, I think I love to name names. Yeah, so first of all, central bankers. Central bankers are a class of actors, right? They are ideologically very, very homogenized across the world. Most central bankers are trained in one of maybe a dozen institutions, and if it's not those institutions, it's using textbooks written by people at those institutions. And if you don't toe the party line, if you don't get certain articles published in certain journals, you don't get to call yourself an economist. Right? There are plenty of political economists I talk about who don't start from the presumption that market efficiency is a coherent concept. They just don't get invited into those rooms because they didn't go to those schools and it's an insular tribe. The United States Fed, I think, hires something like 60% of all graduating macroeconomists. This is a captured discipline with a pseudo-scientific legitimacy justifying policy decisions on an ongoing basis. And that group are the group that are setting the sort of consensus baseline for the political discussions in every country. Every politician in America is terrified of saying something against what the Fed thinks about CBDCs, because they're the only ones with any expertise. And that's a country where politicians like to hate on central bankers. So that's one group. Another group are the tech companies, and not just the tech companies, but the development policy people in the international institutions that are sort of agreeing with that model of predatory financial inclusion. And I think those are international actors as well. The other groups, obviously, the IMF has historically been involved in sort of restructuring of countries and things, and the fact that they're focused on things like breaking labor unions and not things like improving public services or civil liberties, I think you can hold them partially responsible. I mean, the other big part, frankly, is just culture in general. And I will put American culture at the center of that because it finds a way to broadcast itself to the rest of the world. But I think the fact that you're having TV shows and movies and celebrities like Kim Kardashian hawking this stuff with no accountability whether they turn out to be harmful scams or not means that 4-year-olds who like listening to music with a good bass line are suddenly finding themselves hearing about crypto in an extremely twisted way. So there's plenty of blame to go around. The usual place to start is people with 3 or 4 commas next to the zeros in their name, and you work your way down. And the Federal Reserve, the bankers themselves get paid comfortably, but not silly money, but they're working with those kinds of zeros. They think like that.
And the time frame part?
Oh, sorry, the time frame. I think a lot of these conversations happen in the next 3 to 5 years. I mean, the eCash Act that we put out was an attempt to keep a door open in that debate and say, hey, actually central bankers aren't the only institution in the government that have had thoughts about how money should be designed. The Postal Service has done it in the US for a while until we forgot about it. There's still postal banking here, etc. But particularly the Treasury is an actor that is directly accountable to the public. It's directly accountable to elected officials. You can actually put pressure on them in a way you can't with the independent Fed, whose independence is really a theoretical justification for inflation fighting. It has nothing to do with their control over payments, but has somehow spread with mission creep to say that no one can question their views on something like this. But the other part of that with the Treasury is simply that what we're talking about here is a dominant consensus around the world that central bankers aren't going to go out of line with each other. So if you want to do anything other than that increasingly brittle consensus, you're going to have to attack the legitimacy of that institution as the place where these conversations happen. Oh, sorry, and the other thing about the Treasury there is, when it really matters, that central bank independent stuff goes away and the sort of authoritarian police state comes back in. So what happened with Ukraine? Suddenly the term that everybody's learning about is OFAC, right? The Office of Foreign Asset Control. Suddenly what everybody's dealing with in the DeFi space wasn't the concerns that we brought up with the Stable Act around banking risk and credit risk. It was FinCEN is going to require people to identify individuals, and they're going to hold validators responsible for processing transactions they don't like. This was always where it was going to end, right?
Yeah, hi. My name is Yao Nyako. I'm a professor of economics. Teach at NYU, and I'm from Ghana. So I'm going to give you some questions on the economic side and on the developing country side. So first of all, on the economic side, and again, a big shout out to Lauren and everybody else who invited me here. I'm just learning this stuff, trying to figure out what's going on. The conferences I go to, I find that many economists are trying to figure it out too. People are trying to find out what does this thing really mean. I think Melvin King, Bank of England, they came out with something, House of Lords came out with something, something about a solution looking for a question. In other words, many of the places I'm hanging out in and trying to learn from, people don't know, and if anything at all, they're actually negative about it. If you look over there, you see JP Morgan, and I think yesterday Jamie Dimon was actually calling cryptocurrencies Ponzi schemes, okay? So a big negative about that. So on the one side, there's actually quite a bit of, we're all trying to learn, okay? I don't think it's the case that the profession or a group of people are gung-ho on it. I'm definitely at this conference trying to learn. The other side of it too is on the developing country side. And if anything, it's possible that blockchain, cryptocurrency may be more useful in developing countries than in the United States and in the UK. It's possible that the reasons why you'd want these digital currencies are less potent here, because you can have transactions here fairly easily, whereas in Ghana, in Nigeria, people are unbanked, and maybe having these crypto, digital, stable currencies maybe is better than having the CD, the Naira, the CFA franc. We don't know. We just, so again, my point, the only point I'm trying to make is I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're getting us to think through things. Just as one individual, I just say, we're all trying to learn. If you look at the debates on digital currencies, the older generation of economists tend to be against it. And you see the younger scholars are sort of pushing the older folks, saying, hey, guys, give us some breathing room here, okay? Don't be, what is the expression? Yeah. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So first of all, I don't know why I would take JP Morgan's views on this seriously at all. I think half of those leadership should be in jail from the last thing that they screwed up. But the economists, right? You ask the economists, and first of all, they'll say things like money printing always causes inflation, which is bullshit, but that's what their first page of their textbook says, and that's the model they're working with. So I agree with trying to learn, but part of trying to learn is to recognize the blind spots in the methodology you're working with. And there's a lot of economists who don't want to do that because they think that what they're talking about is science, not a theory of social action, which is contestable. And then on the developing country point, I think the problems are often worse there, but that doesn't mean that these solutions have become any better. Right? If the status quo is bad, then you can say any solution at all must be better than the status quo, but it isn't. right? I hate the CFA franc. Ndongo Silla, who wrote the book on it, is a good friend of mine. But he's not sitting there saying we should replace it with some cryptocurrency that promises stability and can't actually deliver it. He's saying we should have a democratic public monetary system there. And that's a different model that isn't going to be represented in a room like this when there's no financial interest behind it. Cool, thanks.
Yay.